Back in the 90s and early 2000s, Final Fantasy was on top of the world. Squaresoft, now known as Square Enix, was held up in the same light as Rockstar or Nintendo are nowadays. Each Final Fantasy game pushed the boundaries of what video games could achieve, with breathtaking visuals, stories that were deep and emotional, fantastic gameplay that was engaging and fun, and a vision that most companies just couldn't compete with. But things began to change as time passed by. With game development becoming more and more expensive, Square Enix decided to shift their focus to spin-offs, films, and sequels that were just underwhelming. Things were starting to decline. Final Fantasy XII was released, and while not poorly received, it just didn't receive the same level of acclaim that Square Enix probably wanted. The focus shifted to Final Fantasy XIII and a game called Final Fantasy Versus 13, which were both revealed back in 2006. Final Fantasy XIII seemed to have everything anyone could want from a Final Fantasy game. Combat seemed engaging, the graphics looked incredible, and the story looked really interesting. And then it came out.
Why? Why is this game so bad? Why did it take half a decade to come out? Final Fantasy XIII is not only different, it's drastically different from older Final Fantasy games, meaning that it actually defies the laws of both physics and logic by generating an even greater amount of suction than every other stale JRPG in existence combined.
For me, Final Fantasy XIII was the worst way I could have been introduced to this series. Years of hearing about all the Final Fantasies and the masses of devoted fans it has, I wanted to know what all the damn fuss was about, so I jumped in. And promptly jumped the hell out.
I hate the gameplay. I hate the story. I hate the characters. The graphics are nice. I hate the design. I hate the hallways. I hate the battle system. It bores the crap out of me, and I can't bring myself to care about any of it.
To top it all off, Final Fantasy XIV was released later that year and was absolutely slammed by both critics and fans. Final Fantasy Versus 13 seemed to be who knows where. It seemed like all hope was lost for the series. Over the next few years, Square Enix released two sequels to Final Fantasy XIII that no one seemed to want. That didn't seem to spark any hope for fans, but Final Fantasy XIV was completely overhauled, and it was relaunched and it became a huge hit with fans. Also, at E3 2013, Final Fantasy Versus 13 was re-revealed as Final Fantasy 15. The game looked absolutely incredible. Final Fantasy Versus 13 always looked promising. The game had an extremely dark aesthetic to it, which contrasted with the very bright and colorful aesthetic of Final Fantasy 13. Its combat was also very action-oriented, similar to Kingdom Hearts. The game seemed to have that awe-inspiring vision that people looked for in a Final Fantasy game, so to finally see the game unburdened by the Final Fantasy 13 name was really exciting. Then 2 years later, another Final Fantasy game was announced, Final Fantasy VII Remake. The original Final Fantasy VII is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time to many people. Final Fantasy VII was the first JRPG for a lot of gamers. It's the first Final Fantasy game to be in 3D. It's a timeless classic, and for years, people have been begging for a remake. There was speculation for years as to whether or not it would be made. Finally though, it was real. Now there were two Final Fantasy games for people to get hyped about. Hopes were high that these two games could restore the franchise back to its former glory. Well, both games have been out for quite a while now, and I've played and beaten both. I think it'd be cool to compare both games and see which one of them turned out better, in my opinion. But let me know what you guys think. Which game do you think turned out better? Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel, as that would really help me out. With all that being said, enjoy the video. I think the biggest difference between these two games is their overall design philosophy. Final Fantasy 15 is a big open world game, while Final Fantasy VII Remake is a generally linear game with occasional bits of exploration sprinkled throughout. Both of these design philosophies have their advantages and disadvantages. In Final Fantasy 15's case, the game offered a lot of freedom, letting you explore the absolutely gorgeous world of Eos with your car or with your chocobo, and you can get involved in a variety of side missions. The game felt incredibly vast and rich. That's one of my favorite aspects of Final Fantasy 15. From the very get-go, the game drops you in the open world. There's no linear hand-holding for the first few hours. While this sounds absolutely amazing, I do think it comes at a price. The focus on the open world in the first half often took away focus from the story story. It almost feels non-existent in the first half of the game. Then in the second half, the open world is completely thrown out the window and the game becomes super linear. And while the narrative is the main focus in the second half of the game, it feels very rushed, and because of that, ends up feeling incomplete. I'm going to get into more detail about this later on. Then we get to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is almost the polar opposite in terms of design. The game is quite linear, but it does include multiple sections where the player can explore moderately sized zones and where the player can tackle side missions. That's the difference between a game like Final Fantasy VII Remake and a game like Final Fantasy XIII. In that game, the player was forced to go on a linear path and had very few moments where they could go and explore or do side missions. Here though, the game does offer multiple moments where the player has freedom, which prevents players from feeling like they're on an on-rails experience. Them ditching the open world also allows them to dedicate more time to the story and focus on the characters more, and because of that, unlike 15, it doesn't feel rushed. If anything, 7 Remake feels a little bit padded out, but I'll also get into more detail about this later on. In the end though, I did like the overall design philosophy for Final Fantasy VII Remake as opposed to Final Fantasy 15, because 7 Remake still had moments of freedom, but at the same time, it felt more focused on its narrative. For decades, Square Enix pushed the envelope when it came to video game graphics. This obsession with visual fidelity led Square Enix to create their own in-house engines, which were very costly and often led to troubles with game development. In the 7th generation of consoles, they created the Crystal Tools engine, which was meant to be used for Final Fantasy XIII, Versus 13, and 14. With the 8th generation of consoles, Square Enix created the Luminous engine, which powered Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy VII Remake wasn't created using the Luminous engine though. Over the course of the last few years, Square Enix has slowly shifted to using Unreal Engine 4 for their games. Unreal Engine 4 has been used for a lot of popular titles like Borderlands 3 and Gears of War 5. Square Enix used Unreal Engine 4 to create Kingdom Hearts 3 and Octopath Traveler. The different engines for Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy 15 give each game a slightly subtle different look, but there is more to visuals than that. With 15, Square Enix's goal was to create a fantasy based on reality. This means that the environments are meant to be more grounded in what we would see in modern day life. You could see that throughout the game as you explore areas that aren't much different from what you would see in real life. 7 Remake also tries to achieve realism in the sense that the environments look realistic and characters interact in a manner that's similar to how we as people interact in real life. However, 7 Remake is based around Midgar's more fantastical and cyberpunk setting, so many of the environments, despite being realistic, feel more fantasy-based than 15. So despite both games pushing realism, 7 Remake's art direction is more in line with older entries than 15 is. I think both of these approaches to visuals work really well, and both games overall do look really amazing. They both feature some fantastic lighting along with some amazing scenery. Character models are really detailed and the effects work in both games is great. While 7 Remake does have players going through different areas within Midgard that do look different, since the game is set mainly in Midgar, a lot of the environments do look quite familiar with each other. Not only that, but the PS4 version has some rough textures. Like, look at that door.
Looks awful.
I haven't played the PS5 version yet, but from my research, that version did iron out a lot of the poor textures found at certain parts of the game. The game still does look amazing though. However, 15 is more varied in terms of its environments. You have deserts, you have forests, you have cities like Altisha. Also, in my opinion, the lighting in 15 is slightly better than 7 Remake. 15 also has better faces, it has better looking textures than 7 Remake, and overall, I think presentation-wise, 15 is a better game. But that's just my opinion though. Both games really do look amazing. Unreal Engine 4 and the Luminous engine really were put to great use here, and as a result, I think both games really got the visual part right. Final Fantasy games have always had amazing music. The original Final Fantasy VII score was composed by Nobuo Uematsu in less than a year. Despite that, the final score ended up being amazing with so many iconic tracks, like One Wing Angel or Aerith's theme. The remake managed to take those songs and somehow update them to work in modern day. And the new songs are amazing too. The song Hollow is incredible, and when you're exploring the Sector 5 slums, the instrumental version plays, and it sounds oddly nostalgic, like it was in the original game even though it wasn't. Final Fantasy XV was composed by Yoko Shimura, who's known for composing the music from Kingdom Hearts. 15's score is great too. It's exciting at times, it's moving at other times. The song Somnus, which is the main theme of the game, is in my opinion one of the most moving songs in any game ever. It's no wonder why that theme was in some of the game's original trailers. None of these games have bad music, but I think I'll give this section to 15's score because at the end of the day, 7 Remake's score for the most part is a modernization of the original 7 score, while 15's score is entirely new. Also, I personally just enjoy listening to 15's score more than 7 Remake's score.
That's not fair.
But like visuals, this section really does come down to your own opinion because both games really do get this part right. The music in both games really is fantastic and is worth listening to. In the past, Final Fantasy games were known for having turn-based combat similar to a lot of other JRPGs. While turn-based combat nowadays is known as a JRPG thing, turn-based combat actually came from the West. Originally it began through pen and paper with Dungeons & Dragons, which was becoming more and more popular during the 70s and 80s. Western game developers then took those rules and adapted them into video games. That changed though with the release of the first Final Fantasy game and the first Dragon Quest game. After that, Japanese developers across the board began to focus more and more on turn-based combat, despite the fact that Western developers began shifting their focus to more real-time combat. For years, Final Fantasy would evolve its turn-based combat. It introduced the active time battle system, which implemented a more real-time feeling of pressure in turn-based combat. Square Enix would keep this system until Final Fantasy X-2, after they shifted their focus more and more into real-time combat. Final Fantasy XV is the biggest realization of this. 15 completely ditches the ATB system from the other games. Instead, it's trying to be a lot more action-oriented, similar to Kingdom Hearts. I honestly really love this system. I love the fast pace of combat and I love how energetic it feels. That being said, it is pretty easy. You could get through quite a bit of the game by essentially holding down the attack button and occasionally dodging. On top of that, there is no cooldown for potions or items, meaning that you could just spam items as much as you want, and if your health points go down to 0, the game will give you a chance to use a Phoenix down, preventing you from dying. This makes the game really easy. Then you get to Final Fantasy VII Remake. Here, combat is a blend of the traditional ATB system and the more action-oriented system of Final Fantasy XV. In my opinion, this system is almost perfect. It retains the energy from Final Fantasy XV's combat, but yet it gives you a chance to strategize, use abilities and magic, which magic in Final Fantasy XV is essentially useless. And unlike 15, the game won't let you spam items or potions. If all the characters die, you can't use a Phoenix down to get back into the game. You lose. Both games let you use multiple characters, however, where 7 Remake feels like it was built with the different playstyles of Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, and Baird in mind, 15 doesn't because at launch you could only play as Noctis. The ability to play as Prompto, Ignis, or Gladio was added post-launch, meaning that the game isn't made with them in mind. I do think I prefer 7 Remake's combat over 15's combat, mainly because it's more difficult and more engaging in my opinion, but I still do like 15's combat, I just think 7 Remake's combat is better. One of the most important parts of any Final Fantasy game is the story. Final Fantasy games were known for telling compelling stories with great characters. I'm going to be getting into spoilers for both 15 and 7 Remake. If you don't want spoilers for either game, go to the time above. 3, 2, 1. Final Fantasy 15, in my opinion, has some great characters. Noctis at first comes across like an emo boy, but when you get to know him more, you really see more layers to his character, and you do realize that at the end of the day, he is just a normal guy. He doesn't feel ready to be king, but yet because of circumstances outside of his control, he has to grow up and become the true king. You have Ignis, who's loyal to Noctis to the end and will never give up on him no matter what. You have Prompto, who is a lovable goofball, but yet he isn't entirely comedic relief either, and he does have more layers to his character outside of comedy. And you have Gladio, who clearly cares about Noctis, but sometimes goes about things in the wrong way. These 4 characters are amazing, and you really do bond with them, and that's why a scene like this, where you have to say goodbye to them, hits so hard.
I've made my peace. Still, knowing this is it, and seeing you here now, it's more than I can take.
Yeah, you're damn right it is.
Huh. You spit it out. That's good to hear.
Well, what can I say? You guys are the best.
This scene right here is one of my favorite scenes in any game ever, and that's because you spend 30 to 40 hours with these characters and seeing them get along, and that's why Noctis having to say goodbye to them works so well. But the problem is there are a lot of elements that just aren't fleshed out as much as they should have been. For example, take Noctis' father. You're supposed to feel a big connection between him and Noctis, but they get so few scenes together that in the end you don't feel too much, and scenes like this, while still nice, aren't as emotional as they could have been had they fleshed out that relationship more. Same thing with Luna. When she died, I felt somewhat upset, but that's largely because of the music that plays in the scene. The truth is, if it wasn't for that music, I would feel next to nothing because you barely see Luna throughout the game. Part of the reason for all of this is that 15's story is stretched out across a movie, an anime, and more. While a lot of this stuff is fully accessible, it doesn't excuse the fact that it should have been in the main game in some way. Now compare this to 7 Remake, where Tifa, Aerith, and Baird are all characters who you develop a deep connection with, which is why you grow attached to them. But other characters like Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge also get great character development, which is why scenes like this, in my opinion, work so well. The first half of Final Fantasy 15 is so focused on the open world that the story barely gets touched on, and the second half feels incredibly rushed. So many big character moments that should have been in the game are not in the game. Like this emotional scene where Ignis has to sacrifice his vision to save Noctis isn't in the main game. This scene where Prompto struggles to determine his worth to Noctis isn't in the main game. This scene where Ravus gets killed by Arden is added into the game as an optional segment later on. 7 Remake includes scenes like this, scenes that were cut out of 15, which makes everything feel more believable. It makes all the characters' inner conflicts more understandable to you, the player. 7 Remake's story is a bit padded out though. There are one too many parts where the game is stretched out too much in my opinion. For example, chapters 10 and 11 where the characters have to get from the sewer all the way to Sector 7 is 2 whole chapters and it's just too long. It takes 3 whole chapters for Cloudbeard and Tifa to attempt to bomb the Sector 8 reactor and fight the Airbuster. I'm fine with downtime, but the game did take it too far. 7 Remake also doesn't feel complete by design because the game is part 1 of a multi-part story, whereas 15 does feel complete in the sense that you do have the beginning, middle, and end. That being said, I do prefer 7 Remake's story over 15's story, purely because you could spend more time with the characters and none of the key moments feel cut out of the game. Except this scene. Overall, I really liked both games. I think they're both really special. In spite of any of the flaws I mentioned, I do think you should play both 15 and 7 Remake. I think both games are absolutely fantastic. That said, I do prefer 7 Remake over 15 because I do think 7 Remake has the better story and the better combat, and in my opinion, I like the more linear nature of 7 Remake as opposed to 15's more open world nature. But I still really like Final Fantasy 15 and I do think it gets too much hate. I just prefer 7 Remake over 15. I'm really excited for the future of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy 16 looks absolutely amazing, and I can't wait to see what happens in Final Fantasy 7 Remake Part 2. But let me know what you think. What game did you think was better? If you liked the video, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and sub, as that would really help the channel out. Stay awesome. Bye-bye.
Well, most people would say something sweet right about now.
I'm sure they would.
Ah, but you're a more discerning customer, aren't you? In which case... our house special, the Cosmo Canyon.
Beautiful.